Welcome to More Than Words, a podcast about treating the whole child, brought to you by the Reading and Language Learning Center. I'm your host, Tristan, and today I'm joined by educational consultant Joanna Salzman to discuss IEPs, 504 plans, and everything else. So, Joanna, hi, how are you?
Fine. How are you doing, Tristan?
I'm doing great. We're excited for you to be here.
I'm very excited to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. So let's start with an introduction. Tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do.
Hey, so again, my name is Joanna Salzman. I am an educational consultant. And basically, what that means is I try to support kids and families in their journey in education, which sometimes is very difficult for them. So if it is difficult, I'm a good problem solver and I'm a good supporter in trying to make sure that they get what they need so that they can be successful in school.
That's
That's
awesome.
basically kind of what I do.
Oh, that's fantastic. You are like a huge asset to these families.
Well,
I know it.
thanks.
Yeah.
Like that.
So if people are looking to work with you, where would they find you?
So I work with families. When I go to meetings and support them, I will go to a school building and support them. Otherwise, when I meet with them to do a lot of pre-work that I do, so I'm prepared, I really work with them online,
Yeah.
via Google Meet mostly. I do have a website. It's jmseduconsulting.com.
Okay.
And that's kind of how you can find me, how you can reach me. You can learn all kind of about me and what I do. And certainly there's lots of different ways to contact me through the website.
Perfect. Okay. So I'll link your website in the show notes and then folks can find you that way.
Perfect. Another way to reach me is to use my phone number, which is 240-994-0330. You can feel free to text or call at any time if you are interested in speaking with me.
Perfect. That's also a fabulous way to reach you. So I'll put that in the show notes as well.
Great.
Awesome. Well, let's hop into our questions for the day. So IEPs, 504, all of these things that if you're new to this world sound crazy. What do they even mean?
Correct. They can be very overwhelming.
Yes. So let's start with like the actual law that provides special education services. What is that? How do you know like what your rights are?
Okay. So the main law that governs special education is the Individuals with Disability Education Act. And basically that act really helps to define how students are identified as a student with an educational disability and how services are provided. It's a big, very long law that it really has a lot of steps to it, but that's really what governs, which I mostly work with schools, that, what they need to do to either say a student has or does not have an educational disability. And then if they do, what they are mandated to do about it.
Okay. And are there other pieces? You said the law is super long. So like, are there other pieces that go with it?
Yes, absolutely. So there are lots of acronyms. There are lots of acronyms in schools, lots of acronyms everywhere. But I'm going to mention the first one I'm going to mention is what we call FAPE. It's free and appropriate education. So parents need to realize that if their child is identified for an educational disability, the expectation for schools is that they are provided free, no cost to the parent, appropriate, what really meets their needs. It's really about the student. They really the I in IEP, which we'll get into a little bit later, which is the individual. Public. So really looking at what public options where they live would be a good match for the student, even if it's not the same school where the student would go to if they in their neighborhood.
Oh, okay.
And, the education, that whatever instruction they need to be successful and to be on the same playing field as all the other students is really what they need and what they deserve to have.
Yeah. I didn't know that law. I mean, I didn't know any of these laws, any of the things that were under it either, but free and appropriate public education. So important. And you said there was another one, right?
Yes, least restrictive environment.
Oh.
So when, say, a student gets an IEP because they qualify for services, we at the very end of that IEP is where we talk about services based on all the needs and all the supports that we'll go into later about what's in an IEP, what would be the least restrictive environment. And basically that's looking at, do we need to remove that student from a general education environment for them to be successful? Some students can be successful in say, a general education class with some supports, either from their classroom teacher, from a special ed teacher, from an assistant, and still be able to be with their non-disabled peers, is a phrase that is commonly used. But other students cannot be successful in that class, that type of environment. So they need a smaller class with possibly a special ed teacher as the lead teacher, and maybe one or two support people in the class, and maybe the class needs to be smaller. So each district, each area where anybody lives, there's a continuum of services in that district. So it's really having the conversation about what is the least restrictive environment for that student.
Right.
And we always start with the general ed because, again, we don't want to remove them if we don't need to.
Right.
But if we do, what are the other options? And that's a team discussion.
Wow. Well, that's really good to hear. Because, sometimes you get two students who might be in a special ed classroom together, and it's like they don't have actually the same issue. So it's good to know that there are laws in place that are protecting families and students to get the most appropriate thing for that kid. So that's awesome.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
That's why the law exists.
Right. So we mentioned the IEP. So let's dig into that. What in the world is it? What does it stand for? What is it?
Absolutely. All right. So IEP is an individual education plan.
Okay.
And it really is a plan that is just about that student. It's a legal document. That's something really important to consider. So while some people just see it as a bunch of pieces of paper, it really, because it's a legal document, it really needs to, first of all, be comprehensive of the students. And then there is accountability to make sure that whatever is in there is provided by the school the school or the staff, because it was developed for a reason, and whatever is in there was put in there because the student needs it.
Absolutely.
So if the student qualifies for special ed, they typically require, they always require, specialized instruction and accommodations to make meaningful progress. That's what, if you qualify for an IEP, basically you need that. You need instruction that's different than everybody else in some respect, and some supports that may be different than what the teacher naturally does to help all students. So just to define specialized instruction, it's instruction that is different than what everybody else is getting.
Okay.
So if the teacher is teaching something about addition, something as simple as that, and they do it in a certain way on a Promethean board or with manipulatives, and the student with an IEP has math as an area of need, they may not get it the same way as all the other students. So they might need a small group to explain it a different way.
Right.
Maybe they're more of an auditory learner, or maybe, whatever their strengths are, we usually try to build on their strengths to get that concept across. But that's really the responsibility that, yes, they're going to get there for the instruction everybody else is going to get no matter where they are.
Right.
But they do need something and require something that is different than everybody else. And, just as an aside, the identification and the services do look different in different jurisdictions.
Okay.
I'm located in the state of Maryland, and I live in Montgomery County, Maryland, but I do serve students in DC, Virginia, and several other states across the country.
Yeah.
And even for me, it's been a learning curve in terms of some of the even what an IEP looks very different, even between Virginia and Maryland, which still learning. Maryland's very comprehensive, but in any event, those are the main places I go to is Maryland, DC, and Virginia. And yeah, the documents are dramatically different. Across
Interesting.
the state, they're basically using the same document, so that's helpful. Like if you just move somewhere in Maryland, it's a state online platform, if you will.
Okay.
And I think at this point every jurisdiction is using it. But yeah, across other places, even their LREs that we talked about earlier are very different, and what they consider least restrictive environment or what different kinds of settings they have. It's something that you'd have to consider wherever you live,
Right.
and even when you're moving. Parents do ask me, okay, I'm moving to here,
Right.
I'm moving to the state, do you know what they have there? And that's really an important question.
Absolutely.
Mm,
So when you're looking at an IEP to begin with, and like you said, they can be different depending on the state, jurisdiction, all of that. What are the major parts of the IEP that you want to look out for and make sure are present?
absolutely. So the IEP generally is a very, very long document, and it can be
Okay.
very, very overwhelming. And
Yeah.
my advice to anybody that is seeing one for the first time, I do work with families who get one for the first time. I do kind of an IEP 101
Okay.
because, and I provide feedback to the school and they can't even understand the document, let alone my feedback. It just is a lot. It's a
Yeah.
lot. It's very overwhelming. But one of the major parts of the IEP, the first one I'm going to talk about, is called present levels of performance.
Okay.
And basically, present levels is the data. It's all the data that supports what areas of need students have. Sometimes students have many, many areas on their IEP of areas where they need specialized instruction and or supports like accommodations,
Right.
which I believe we'll talk about a little bit later. But um, for instance, if a student has math calculation, reading comprehension, and written language as 3 areas of need,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to see a section of data about those things. And
Okay.
it's going to be about 2 to 3 data points. And if it's the reading comprehension one, I'm going to read all about, some strengths too, like what they're good at, but then what are the areas of need and how does that person writing it know it? Like
Mm-hmm.
if they say they have trouble answering who, what, where questions. Okay, that's definitely comprehension. So,
Right.
but tell me what data points you're using so you know that, or
Right.
are you just making it up?
Right.
I want to know. I really like. So I read that. I should just as even somebody who doesn't know the child as well. I should be looking at that and say, oh, okay, it really makes sense to me.
Right.
And these sections, the present levels, really inform the rest of the document
Okay.
because I'm constantly, when I'm looking at an IEP, flipping back to present levels because the rest of these sections of the IEP should be based on the data from present levels. So if the data
Gotcha.
is not there, or if it's like 2 or 3 sentences, that's a problem
Yeah.
because there should be lots of data to support this as an area of need, or else why is it even there?
Right.
And then how am I writing the rest of the IEP if I don't have the data?
Right.
So, so that's like the most important thing for me
Right.
is looking at data. And some schools don't do a good job at collecting
Mm-hmm.
data. So then if I'm representing a family, I'm kind of asking those questions and really in some ways pressuring them to make sure that they have it because the
Right.
student deserves the support to meet them where they are and move them forward. And if you don't know where they are, how can you support
Right.
them?
Yeah.
So
Wow.
that part is the most important to me. Data. It's all about data.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
So present levels of performance. You said it's normally like the first thing that's in there, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that is
Yes.
interesting. Because normally, at least from what I have like gathered, you hear all about the IEP, like this is written in there, but you forget that like it has to start somewhere and it can't just be with one person saw
Mhm.
this, one person saw this, and then you write a whole document based on what he said, she said.
Mhm.
So that is,
Absolutely.
really important that parents know to look for that first individual or initial set of data for their kiddo. That makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It
Yeah.
does.
So who is the decider of what goes into a child's IEP?
So it is really a team effort, but a lot of the weight falls on the special education teacher.
Okay.
When a team comes together and decides they have a disability, then that writing happens. And if I'm the special educator, I'm going to be the lead to take all the data and kind of put it into the IEP from the identification. But there are certain areas where, like, even I don't have that expertise. So if the student has speech and language services,
right,
or they have occupational therapy or physical therapy, and some kids have psychological therapy,
yeah,
or therapy through a counselor,
right,
then those people would write their present level and their data, and then they would determine what supports and what goals they need to work on.
okay,
There's usually a general educator involved. There's usually an administrator who is at the meeting. Parent has input into what is important. And while parents may feel that it's not their expertise, they know their child best. And I try to enforce that. Some of my clients will ask me, well, it's going to be our first meeting. Should I speak? Yeah, you better
yeah,
speak. I'm hired to speak for you,
right,
but you know your child best.
right,
You better than me, better than anybody sitting in the room. So if you don't hear something, like, say there's an area of need, if you think, you know, written language is a difficult area and it's not even on the IEP, then that's a time to speak up and say, when I read, Johnny's writing samples at home, I can barely read them, or they don't
yeah,
make any sense, or they don't seem to answer the question. And I wanted to know more about that. Maybe it should be in his IEP,
yeah,
just as an example.
yeah.
So yeah, it is a team of people. It's a team collaborative effort. But in terms of the draft, usually that draft is coming from that special educator, and it is just a draft because it's never finalized until the team meets and the parent approves it.
That's a good process. It feels nice to have someone who comes in that has the actual data and then gives you the kind of like a skeleton almost. And then the parent and like you said, the administrator, the gen ed, like all of those folks come in and say, yep, this makes sense. This makes sense. But also, I'm seeing this issue. We need to add that. That's such a great way to go about that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I guess I'm going to mention just three other areas.
Okay.
The first one I'm going to mention, well, actually, I'm going to mention two kind of together. One is called accommodations, and
Okay.
one is called supplementary aids and services.
Yeah.
And basically, both of those things are supports that kids need to be successful in the classroom, whether it's a general classroom, special ed classroom, just really supports. Typically, the accommodations are defined, like in the state of Maryland, as an example, they're defined by the state of Maryland. There's
Okay.
actually a manual, and it's online. And sometimes I send it to families. Hey, you can peruse this, especially if it's the first IEP. Even me that knows them really well, when I'm editing an IEP, sometimes just to kind of go through, I'll just make sure I'll like run through them online and just say, oh, that might be a good one. And it's defined for you. And if it doesn't meet the definition, then it won't be included in the child's IEP.
Okay.
But examples could be extended time, frequent breaks, even noise buffering headphones
Oh,
for
yeah.
kids who have sensory issues. So some of them are really important and good ones to think about. And there's many, many, many more, believe me,
Yeah.
calculator and
Right.
such. But the data from those present levels, again, has to even support the accommodations.
Yeah.
So I should most likely see calculator as an accommodation if there's like no math needed.
Right.
And sometimes I do see that. And then, of course, I ask the
Interesting.
question, well, I'm not going to tell you no about the calculator until I find out why, when
Right.
that wasn't in the present levels as data that, was a need at this
Right.
time. So why is that?
Hmm.
The supplementary aids are very similar to the accommodations, except they can really be anything, and they're not defined by the state of Maryland. They're
Interesting.
very, again, individualized to the student. And it could be and this is an example I use often. I have a student who has autism, and they really respond to certain colors sometimes at certain times of the year, sometimes for the whole year.
Hmm.
So in one of my IEPs that I support, one of my clients, it says use green font as, basically periodically or as much as possible and such,
Right.
because when the student sees green, they just pay attention more. They participate more. You don't see that on very many IEPs,
Right.
but it is for the student and it does help. So
Wow.
we put it down. So it really is, and that's a good time too. Sometimes general educators who may have a special ed background may not know a lot. It's the time to sometimes ask them, well, what are you doing naturally in the classroom to support, the students? And sometimes it's just natural supports, and they'll say, well, that's just the best practice. That's just what I do.
Mm.
And then my question is, well, if they need it, say you didn't do it, would the student be okay? And sometimes it's like, oh no, they wouldn't be. Well,
Right.
that's why you have to put in the IEP.
Wow.
It's not just a best practice. There's a lot of good, and that's what a lot of teachers sometimes say to me. Well, that's just a best practice. It doesn't need to go on the IEP. I just do it. And sometimes I'll say, well, what if they're going to move teachers next year?
Right.
And what if they move to Iowa next spring? Are they going to do the same things you're doing?
Right.
Oh no, they're not. Well, again, I don't want to put things in there they don't require.
Right.
But if you think about it that way, if you took it away, you didn't do that, would the student be okay? And if the answer is no, then it should be in there. It's a support.
Wow,
Yeah.
that is such a good point. I have never thought about that because like there are teachers out there that they're kind of problem solvers, right? And so their
Yeah.
initial instinct is just to be like, I see this works for this kid, I'm going to do that, and you do what you need to do, right? But not everyone has the same thought process, right? So they
Right.
may not see that they're trying to solve the problem, but they don't know what the solution is. But
Absolutely.
if you've given the solution, then put it in the IEP. Oh my gosh, that's genius.
Yeah, it's really important. And that's where, like, sometimes, like I said, general educators don't know where they kind of fit in this process.
Right.
And that's a great question to ask them. What does this child need to be successful? What do you find is really important for them to be successful in your classroom?
Right.
Because a special educator might be there a lot, might be there a little bit. But like, especially in elementary school, they typically only have one teacher and they have a student all day long. Well, I bet you know a few things that could we put in there that could be helpful. So
Wow.
yeah,
That's
it's great.
very cool.
And then the last part for me, well, I guess I'll do two more.
You're fine.
The next part is goals.
Okay.
So got your data for present levels, and then based on that, we identified the accommodations and supplementary aids. And then there's a goal that is really that specialized instruction. What is the goal that they need to work on so that they can be as close to where the other kids are, or it could be a goal that is part of the curriculum,
Mhm.
but unless they get specialized instruction, they're not going to make progress on it.
Gotcha.
So if there is a reading comprehension, as I used earlier as an example, there's data support, and it says very clearly that, like, I actually have teams say strengths and needs at the end. So
Oh yeah.
even if they put a lot of data on there, and then it's fine, I read it all, but sometimes it is hard to even discern, well, what are you telling me is the needs? I
Right.
mean, I'm not saying it's not a need, but what are the needs?
Right.
So it helps them to figure that out and then write a goal based on it, and sometimes more than one goal.
Yeah.
So it could be a goal based on answering WH questions, on what they read, on what maybe the teacher shares a story and they're listening, maybe the listening comprehension. But the goal should be, and when I'm looking at goals, I go back to present levels. Oh, is that data there to support that particular goal?
Right.
Yes, sometimes I'm like, oh, this sounds like a really good goal, but I don't see any data. I have no idea how you came up with this goal, basically.
Right.
So, and then they'll maybe add some data as a result. So yeah, looking at each of the areas, most areas lend themselves to writing goals. There's a few exceptions. Like I have some students who are challenged with, blindness and some vision challenges.
Yeah.
So while that's definitely an area of impact, and while there's some supports, like definitely accommodations and supplementary aids that, most of them are not totally blind, but have very significant issues where they one of the accommodations or supplementary aids is that they have to blow up the text because they can't
Okay.
see a normal font. And it
Right.
might even specify what the number is. Could be size
Wow.
24 font or whatever it
Okay.
is. It's very specific. But then there really wouldn't be a goal to work on vision, if
Right.
that makes sense. But in most academic areas, that it would make sense. Social emotional areas like students who have difficulty with coping skills,
Mhm.
with behavior of any kind, they're going to have some goals to work on as well as supports. And yeah, the speech OT, PT,
Right.
all those will definitely have goals. The goals are very specific in terms
Mhm.
of what supports they need to work on the goals. And then usually under the goal, there's objectives to kind of break down the goal. As a
Oh,
result of this kind of overarching goal, there's not a magic number,
right.
usually at least C2,
Okay.
3, 4, 5, it usually is steps on how to master that goal.
Okay.
Like if my reading comprehension goal is answering who, what, where, when questions, I might actually have an objective on each one. I'm not
Oh,
putting them
yeah.
all in one, because what if they only do who and what and they don't do the other? So
Right.
it's really targeted to specific skills, and parents should be looking out to see progress on those goals
Right.
quarterly.
Okay.
Just like they get a report card every quarter for their
Right.
kid, they should also be getting the goals and marked, not the same as report cards like A, B, C, and D,
Right.
but are they making progress? Are they not making progress? Maybe they just got an IEP and it wasn't addressed yet.
Mhm.
Maybe not in curriculum. I don't like that answer too much, but sometimes that happens. So it's not addressed yet. And usually there should be data to support what they're saying even there. Like,
Right.
well, they're making progress. It's nice to hear, but are you just telling me that, or
Right.
show me or write me a little couple of sentences that show me that in some data
Yeah.
you've collected?
Yeah. I was going to
After the
ask you, I'm
goals
glad
are
you said quarterly you should look for.
quarterly.
Yeah. And is the IEP written for the whole year? So are the goals for the entire school year?
Yes, it's a good question. Yes. The only requirement once you have an IEP is they meet annually. So it is
Okay.
for a year. The school can call a meeting anytime they want to,
Okay.
and the parent can also call a meeting anytime they want to. I have
Okay.
lots of clients who call meetings all the time
Yeah.
because they want to check in. They're concerned about something. Maybe we need to add something. The good thing about an IEP is also that while like it takes a lot of work to finish it, it's not like it's done for the year, and you can it's a fluid document, and if
Okay.
things are in there that aren't working, we can meet and talk about it, maybe remove them and replace them with other things. And yeah, it's always a work in progress. There are some families, I'm sure, that just have the once a year meeting, and if things are going well, then that's great.
Right.
I would just want to have parents kind of look out for that. If they have any concerns whatsoever, all they have to do is ask for a meeting, and
Yeah.
within a reasonable amount of time, the school should be setting something up.
Wow. That's good to
Yeah.
know too.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so while we're on the topic of parents and the IEP meeting, how is it that they should prepare for an IEP meeting? Maybe the first one and like any subsequent meetings.
Absolutely. I think some of it really is going through the document and making a list of questions,
Yeah.
right? Just, what sticks out, what's missing from the document, what things don't you understand? Because it's not always written in a user-friendly way. There's always acronyms. And whenever I hear an acronym at a meeting, I will then say, even though if I know the answer, what does that mean again?
Right.
Not to put or make anybody feel bad, but it should be user-friendly. Sometimes there's just like scores and numbers, and it's like, well, what does that number mean? Is
What does
that
that
good?
mean? Yeah.
Is that a good thing? Is it average? Is it, you know, give me some more context,
Absolutely.
because you might know what it means, and I'm sure you do, but the parent doesn't. And
Yeah.
even if it's not about me, it's about the parent understanding it. So I would think that there would be some questions there. Another good question for parents to always ask, so they are a team player along with the school, and the school should be obviously with the parent too,
Yeah.
is, well, what can I do at home?
Mhm.
What are some things I can do at home to support my child so that they can be successful? And I would hope that teachers would be very open to share materials, share links to resources, whatever, if a parent's saying, I'm going to make time to support what you're doing at school, because I know my student has some challenges. I want to support at home. What can I do in the home environment? But they should feel open to ask questions and then really go through the document. And if something doesn't make sense, maybe they print it out, highlight it, be ready at that meeting. And they shouldn't feel rushed at the meeting. Most meetings, they kind of cut you off at an hour, like time's up, see you later. And that's not the way it should be. Unfortunately, I did attend a lot of meetings where it's part 2, part 3, even if I ask for 90 minutes or 2 hours ahead of time, because sometimes they don't understand who I am and what I'm going to be doing. And then, then we don't finish. and even if there's not an advocate there, they should feel empowered to, if they have 20 questions and hour runs out, like, well, I still have a few to ask. Can we do a continuation meeting? And it shouldn't be no, it should be, yes, we will do that. And we will schedule another meeting as soon as possible, or we'll schedule it right now. So you make sure you get all your questions answered. Because again, your parent, but your child best, excuse me. And, I'm sure I always have questions. There's no document I looked at that I don't have questions. And I have 33 years behind me. So for a parent who doesn't have even an education background, I have no doubt that there's a lot of questions. It might just maybe that feeling that you can't ask because you don't have the educational background, and just that's not the case at all. Just always remember that you have power and it's about your child.
So what you've got the IEP draft and you read it beforehand, right? Come in with the document. So then what actually happens at the IEP meeting itself?
So most jurisdictions have another law that says that you have to get the draft ahead of time. It wasn't always in practice, even back in the day when I was teaching and early on in my career, this didn't exist. But all systems have some type of timeline so that they can be meaningful participants, which is a really good thing. For instance, in Maryland, it's 5 business days ahead of time that you get the IEP. In DC, it's 10, which is amazing. In Virginia, it's 2. So then, I don't like Virginia that much for that reason, because then I get it. And especially if I'm part of the way I work is to give them feedback before we meet. So when the 5-day documents come flooding in with all the meetings I'm going to have, then I am really working right away, because some parents want to put their own feedback, or at least look over what my feedback is before I send it to the school. And I don't want to send it the day before to the school, because they might be like, well, I'm not going to look at it. But my hope would be sometimes they look at it, and if they agree with anything, they submit me another draft at some point, and they have some of the things I recommended, which helps with the flow of the meeting. If I don't, all the feedback is just kind of my agenda. That's what we're going to talk about. But usually the flow of the meeting, regardless of what feedback I have, it's pretty much in order of kind of what I shared with the major parts. They'll go even from the front cover, where the parent's name and address and all that. They'll just verify, is your address still the same? Is your, all that stuff. But we'll go right into the data. And if they, or even if they just say, thank you, Ms. Salzman, appreciate it. Okay, well then, and I've done my work. I'm ready. So I have my document, which is my email, in front of me. And, they'll look at the first present level, which maybe is, math problem solving. And I'll look at my notes and, hey, so what do you think about my notes? And just kind of make sure that we kind of get that data looking the way it is, and we move on to the next section. And it is a lot of parts, because I didn't mention all of them, of course, in our time today. And then, at the end, you finally get to services, which is really important, because we want to make sure the child gets the services they need to implement this IEP with fidelity. But it's pretty, it flows very nicely from the
Okay.
data to the supports to the goals and then the services,
Right.
which some parents are very anxious about that they're last only because everything else informs even the services too. Like
Right.
now that we have all these goals and these areas of need, do they need 10 hours of special ed? Do they need 25 hours? And it's not an exact science anyway, but
Right.
certainly it helps for, I've had IEPs with only one area of need, and sometimes it's like 3 hours, and that
Wow.
makes sense. It is enough just to work on the one skill because they're
Yeah.
still going to get it in their, say, general ed class, but then the special ed teacher will work on it. And to meet that goal, 3 hours might be enough. So
Yeah.
it's a work in progress.
Wow.
I'm sure it goes lot faster when I'm not there asking all my questions. But
But
even again, if an educational consultant is there, I advise parents to really come with all their questions about it is a draft and they are just as important as everybody else around on the table.
absolutely. Yeah. 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 I mean, it's their kid
Mhm.
who's
It's
there.
their child. Yep, that's right.
Wow.
Mhm. Mhm.
So we talked mostly about the IEPs, and there's another acronym that gets thrown around a lot that I think people don't know as much about, which is the 504 plan. So what
Yes.
is that?
Okay. So the 504 plan is it's the Federal Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and
Okay.
it prohibits the discrimination against any person with disabilities in any program that's receiving federal assistance.
Okay.
So public schools receive federal assistance.
Right.
So therefore, that's why part of their onus is to also case manage 504 plans.
Okay.
So in terms of IEPs and 504s, I guess we'll talk first about qualifying.
Okay.
There are some students who have a disability, but it's not a disability that requires specialized instruction.
Okay.
So if they may have even a learning disability or ADHD or autism, but they're really achieving pretty much on par with their non-disabled peers,
Mhm.
but they need some supports. They need those accommodations and supplementary aids that I talked about. And that's basically the whole plan of a
Okay.
504 plan. A lot shorter,
Right.
in terms of decision making. I usually, when I go to a 504 meeting, they might identify the student and develop a plan all in one meeting because
Wow.
it's still problem solving and making sure the supports they need are still in there.
Right.
And sometimes there's still pushback about, well, do they need this? Do they need that? But it's still important because there are students like I just went to one recently where the the main the main reason we went was they have very slow processing, but they have the skills. They can do it. They just need the extra time. So
Right.
extended time is absolutely on there because given extended time, they can perform on with their peers.
Right.
I guess if they were struggling and they needed more time and more time wasn't enough,
Right.
that would be more into the IEP realm. But
Okay.
there's no goals and there isn't any services on a 504.
Interesting.
It's just literally the supports, all the teachers, like, because I support elementary, middle, and high, any teacher that works with the student, and I guess even in elementary, the PE teacher, the art teacher,
Yeah.
anybody that really works with that student should get a copy of the 504 and the IEP, by the way, that,
Oh, yeah.
it's considered confidential. And some parents worry about that. I have a parent who she has made sure that there is a code for every document that's sent.
Yeah.
So that I only have one, but I get it.
Right.
So you've got
Absolutely.
your child's plan floating around there.
Right.
But it really should only be in the hands of those that work with the child. But yeah, the
Right.
504 really is about what accommodations do they need to be successful.
Yeah. So that's interesting because like you hear the difference between the two. So it sounds like the 504 plan is more, is it that list that you said is on like for Maryland? So it's just all the like accommodations part of the IEP kind of, right?
Yeah, and the
Okay.
supplementaries. The
Okay.
supplementaries were the ones that aren't defined by the state, but really a combination of both of those things.
Okay.
What supports do they need to be successful that are not goals and certainly wouldn't be services? Just
Right.
that the expectation is that they are just provided those things.
Yeah.
every day.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Good to know.
Mhm.
So, what can a parent do if they feel the IEP or the 504 plan isn't being implemented as was outlined in the meeting?
Certainly, if they have concerns, one way to go about it is to ask for a meeting. They
Yeah.
can ask for me with or without an advocate, but say they just go to a meeting. And now, if you're thinking um, that the plan is not being implemented, then your questions that you come to the table with are not just about the plan; they're strategic.
Yeah.
It's about, you might just ask a very general question. Well, how's my daughter Lauren doing in the area of reading, decoding? At home she seems to struggle with sounding out those words. Can you tell me about that? Teacher says, oh, she's doing a great job. Da, da, da. I have her in group. And okay, well, she's supposed to get specialized instruction.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me what the specialized instruction looks like? Because my understanding is there's a goal on decoding. I'm looking at it right now. Here it is on page 52. And, I just want to know, are you the only one working on that? And can you share some of the data about that? Like this, we just got the quarterly progress, and when she started last quarter to now in those 2 months, or 8 weeks or what have you, 10 weeks, I think it is 10 weeks. Where has the growth been, or how do you know? Can you show me? Is there some things that you can show me? So it's really like you're not an attorney, but you're kind of acting like one.
Yeah.
Because you want the evidence to say, if they say the child's making progress, you have the right kind of to ask that.
Yeah.
So I think that's mostly it. Another thing you can do though is you can hire an advocate.
Yeah.
A lot of people hire advocates, and myself, because number one, they're feeling there's not good communication in
Mm.
the school system between them, like they're being ignored, they're not being heard.
Right.
And another is that they feel like they're not getting the things on the IEP. And sometimes they mention very specific things. I know they're not giving my child extended time. And especially at the middle and high school level, they might come home and say no. Like
Right.
they didn't give it to me when everybody was done. I had to be done too.
Oof.
And then it's very telling. So, talking to your child is also, if it's appropriate,
Right.
another situation it's not appropriate, but if
Right.
you can talk to your child, I've interviewed some children and
Yeah.
asked them. I went through a list with one child, and some of them has said to me, oh, that would be great, but they don't do that for me,
Oh
Joanna.
my
And I'm
gosh.
like, oh my God, out of the mouths of babes, right? Like,
Yeah.
and then I bring it up at the meeting. What are they going to say? And sometimes the parent, the child is there. Like this was an eighth grader who came to the meeting, and she comes to all our meetings.
Yeah.
She feels comfortable. It's not a thing. Other kids do not feel comfortable. And
Right.
by high school, they probably should be attending.
Yeah.
If again appropriate, there are kids with cognitive disabilities that would not be appropriate. But yeah, sometimes kids can speak out, and I had my list ready of the things she said. And sometimes she said, oh yeah, they do that for me. Like, okay, great. And other
Right.
times, yeah, oh, that sounds like a great idea. Oh, no, yeah,
Oh.
great idea is not good enough. So yeah, you can advocate for yourself. You can certainly hire someone to advocate for you.
Right.
And then every jurisdiction, if you feel like maybe even after you ask for a meeting that you're not getting anywhere, or even
Mm.
before that, you're like, if I go to a meeting, I'm going to get nowhere with these people. There's always some kind of office. I'm sure it's a different name for every jurisdiction, but it's kind of a compliance office, if you will,
Okay.
where you can contact them in your school district and basically call somebody up, email somebody and say, hey, this school has had my child for X amount of years, or 6 months or whatever it is, and I really don't think that they're doing all the things on the IEP, and I know that's a
Mm.
legal document, and I have concerns, and there's different avenues that you can be a part of, such as it's something called administrative review.
Mm.
There's a mediation, and then there's hearing, where it involves attorneys, and some families do go to that level.
Right.
Certainly my recommendation would be, if you can work it out on the lower end of that, that you try to do that.
Right.
But even filing, and sometimes that makes schools sit up and do what they're supposed to do. It shouldn't be that way. But
Right.
if you contact the compliance office, and then of course they usually follow up with a phone call to you to get more information, and then they'll contact the school, and certainly nobody likes a call from that office.
No.
About if they're doing their job, basically.
Right.
So yeah, that kind of alerts people to step it up. It should just be that it should happen, but
Right.
unfortunately, there's too many teachers and schools, and that while they've gotten into their field for a reason, they're just not doing due diligence with your child, their child, a child that they're working with.
Yeah.
So those are some things they can do.
Yeah, it's good to know that those are there. Because I'm assuming that, like, if I don't have kids yet, but I'm assuming that at this point I wouldn't have known that, right? I would have gone back to the school again and again and again. And if I just continued to be frustrated, I would have just continued to be frustrated.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. One other thing you can do is, and I don't know what the obligation really is, but you can insist that, say, a special ed supervisor or the special ed supervisor of that school attend the meeting.
Oh, okay.
I've had that happen too as well. And sometimes that is very helpful.
Yeah.
Usually that person is in that position for a reason.
Right.
That was a position I used to have. And when there was just families who felt like they were spinning their wheels.
Yeah.
And, we're actually hesitant about going to the compliance office. And I understand that. It's a little scary. And like, oh my God, what am I getting myself into? What is the school going to think of me? Are they going to take it out on my child? That's what I usually hear. They're going to take it out on my child. And, it's maybe easy for me to say because it's not my child, but it should be the opposite, really. It should be like, oh, I better do what I'm supposed to do. But sometimes that person, they might end up chairing the meeting, this supervisor, they might direct the conversation, ask some pointed questions as well.
Right.
And they might get the school's number very quickly. And even when, say, the parent leaves, that supervisor might stay after and kind of have a conversation with that school. And sometimes you can tell that's going to happen at the end, or even from the questions and the answers you get and the supervisor's face, you can go, they're starting to understand what the parent's problem is.
Right.
Yeah, it's not a good thing, but that's another solution, to ask for somebody else from the outside, but still in the county or area to come.
Yeah, that's a good idea as well.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Well, I have one last question for you, which is, you are an educational consultant. So how is it that you help advocate for someone's child?
It's a really good question. So this is only my third year doing this, even though I was in school systems for 30 years. So it's great to be on the other side working with the families.
Yeah.
So part of my process is, before I say go to a meeting, which is one of the many things I do, I will get a lot of history from the family first.
Okay.
And do a lot of reading. I will ask for a lot of documents that will catch me up. Sometimes it's the current IEP, the current 504 plan. Some of my families want those things, so then my documents may be different. Educational assessments, any kind of assessment that will help me give me a picture of that child. So I do a lot of reading, and then I kind of do an intake meeting with the family. Okay. And as a result of my reading, I have a lot of questions. So I'll ask all my questions. And after I'm done, I come up with a plan. What are we going to do? Sometimes they tell me there's a meeting coming up in a month. I'm like, okay, great. If it's coming up next week, I'll probably say to them, I'm not going to be ready yet. And you don't want me just popping into a meeting. So you either go to that meeting without me, or you postpone it. Yeah. They usually postpone it, but it depends. So once I feel I'm ready, I will, typically the first step is going to an IEP meeting. Sometimes the next step is observing the student. Sometimes I wish I can tell you, Tristan, that I observe every student, but I don't.
Yeah.
It is one of my fees too, so I'm sensitive to that.
Right.
Sometimes I kind of insist. I'm like, depending on what we just decided, if I have not seen this child, then I'm not sure how I'm going to advocate, even with my experience with so many kids and so many disabilities. So yes, I attend meetings. I review documents. I provide feedback, as we kind of alluded to before. That's a huge part of my job.
Right.
I do observations. Even after the intake meeting, the document flow is consistent. Like, oh, this child's going through testing, and now I'm going to get this and get that. I do educational assessments. I can provide those. A lot of times, certainly they will, if the school is willing to do it, then they'll have the school do it because it's for free. But that is one of the services that I can provide. And I do have attorneys hire me as an expert witness in special education. Just because I have that background, and sometimes I'm just hired to testify. Right. So I may not have any background in the family. Certainly I'll do some, work reading, and then I'll meet with the attorney and the family, but it might not be anybody I've ever met before. And, basically my job is to prove that they need whatever decision. And if I don't approve, I don't do that work.
Right.
But so far I have, and anybody that's hired me. So, and I do have a family that just wanted to hire me. They want me to do some meetings at the school, but she already has hearing dates. So
wow.
Like, okay. All right. And that's in late April. And I thought, okay, that's manageable for me.
Yeah.
So those are mostly, I guess, the main things that I do, but I do have a services list. I give it to all my families, and I let them know I'm not going to do all the things on here, most likely, but this is what I can provide.
Yeah, that's awesome. It sounds like very fulfilling work and very hard work. So thank you for doing it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It is. I'm a little tired, but I also know that when school lets out, usually a little summer break for me too.
Right. You get a reprieve.
Nice. Yes.
That's awesome. Well, I think that was my last question for you. Thank you for being here. This has been fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
So helpful.
Great. Well, I'm glad.
Thank you so much to the audience for listening. Make sure to subscribe and leave us a little rating and review. It helps other folks find the podcast, and we'll chat with you next time.